There are moments in politics when a single statement doesn't just make headlines, it tears open a wound that millions of people didn't even know was still bleeding. This is one of those moments. When Donald Trump made his latest remarks about women, the reaction wasn't just swift, it was seismic. Protests erupted, social media exploded, politicians from both sides were forced to respond. And once again, the world found itself asking the same question it has been asking for nearly a decade. How does a man who repeatedly sparks this kind of outrage continue to hold such enormous political power? The answer to that question is far more complicated and far more revealing about modern society than most people are willing to admit. To understand what happened, you need to understand the context in which these remarks were made. Trump, speaking in his characteristically unfiltered style, made statements that were widely interpreted as dismissive, demeaning, or outright disrespectful toward women. The specific phrasing, the tone, and the setting all combined to create something that went beyond a political gaffe. For millions of women, it wasn't just offensive language. It felt like a direct signal about how they are valued in public life, in political spaces, and in the broader national conversation. That distinction matters because this wasn't simply about words. Words from powerful people carry weight. They shape culture. They tell people what is acceptable. Now, here is where the deeper analysis begins, because if you only focus on what was said, you miss the far more important story of why it keeps happening and why it keeps mattering. Trump has operated throughout his political career with a communication strategy that defies every conventional rule of modern politics. Traditional politicians are trained to speak carefully, to avoid alienating voter blocs, to stay inside safe rhetorical boundaries. Trump does the opposite, and he does it deliberately. His team and his base understand something that his critics often refuse to acknowledge. The controversy is not a liability for him. It is a tool. Every time he makes a statement that causes outrage, he dominates the news cycle. Every time the media spends 72 hours analyzing his words, his name is in every headline, on every screen, in every conversation. Attention in the modern political economy is currency, and Trump has proven himself to be extraordinarily skilled at generating it. But here is the other side of that reality, and this is the part that his supporters often refuse to acknowledge. The impact of these statements is not abstract. When a man who holds or has held the highest office in the world makes dismissive remarks about women, it sends a message far beyond the political arena. It reaches into workplaces where women are already fighting to be taken seriously. It echoes in courtrooms where women are trying to assert their legal rights. It reverberates in homes where young girls are watching and listening and forming their understanding of what the world thinks of them. The harm is not hypothetical. It is documented, measurable, and deeply human. So why does this backlash keep happening? And perhaps more importantly, why does it seem to change so little? Part of the answer lies in political tribalism. The United States, like many democracies around the world, has become so deeply divided along partisan lines that statements which would have ended a political career 20 years ago now barely register as disqualifying within certain communities. Trump's base, a significant and loyal segment of the American electorate, has developed what analysts describe as a high tolerance for controversy. They have been trained over years to view media outrage not as a legitimate warning sign, but as proof of bias against their chosen leader. So when the backlash comes, and it always comes, it doesn't erode his support. In many cases, it reinforces it. This creates a deeply frustrating cycle for those who oppose him. Every controversy generates outrage. Every outrage generates coverage. Every piece of coverage keeps Trump at the center of the national conversation. And every time his opponents respond with maximum anger, they risk looking reactive, emotional, and politically unfocused to the very voters they need to persuade. It is a trap built into the architecture of modern media. And Trump, whether by instinct or strategy, has learned to exploit it with remarkable consistency. But let's step back from the political chess game for a moment, because buried inside this story is a much older and much more universal conflict. This is not really just about Trump. Trump is a symptom. The deeper story is about where women stand in political power structures across the world and how much or how little that has changed. Women make up slightly more than half of the global population. In most developed countries, they vote in equal or greater numbers than men. They run companies, lead governments, command military units, and shape economies. And yet, in nearly every corner of the world, they still face a political environment that was not built for them, that does not always respect them, and that sometimes treats their concerns as secondary to more serious issues. The backlash to Trump's remarks did not emerge from a vacuum. It emerged from decades of accumulated experience, a collective memory of being talked over, dismissed, underestimated, and reduced. When women react with anger to statements like these, they are not overreacting to a single moment. They are responding to a pattern, and that pattern has data behind it. Studies on gender representation in politics consistently show that women who seek public office face disproportionate scrutiny of their appearance, their tone, their family lives, and their emotional responses, none of which are applied with equal intensity to their male counterparts. The double standard is not imagined. It is embedded in how politics is covered, discussed, and consumed. So who, specifically, is affected by this kind of controversy, and how? The most immediately affected are the women who already exist on the margins of political life, those who are considering running for office, considering speaking up in public forums, considering stepping into leadership roles in their communities. Research shows that hostile political environments have a measurable chilling effect on women's political participation. When the public discourse around women in power becomes saturated with dismissiveness and contempt, fewer women choose to enter that arena. The cost is not just symbolic. It is a genuine reduction in the diversity of voices shaping policy. Policy that affects everyone, including the people who never follow politics at all. Young women and girls are also affected in ways that are harder to measure but no less real. What children observe about how the world treats women in public life shapes their own sense of possibility. When the most powerful men in the world speak about women in ways that diminish them, and when that behavior carries no meaningful consequence, it teaches a lesson. That lesson is absorbed quietly, often unconsciously, and it shapes the ambitions, the self-perception, and the resilience of an entire generation. Men are affected too, though in a different way. Every moment like this forces a cultural reckoning. It asks men to decide, publicly or privately, what kind of treatment of women they are willing to normalize. The silence of political allies is itself a statement. The men who say nothing, who calculate that speaking up costs more than it gains, are making a choice, and that choice has consequences for the political culture they help create. Now let's talk about what happens next, because that is always the most important question. In the short term, expect the news cycle to follow its familiar rhythm. The initial outrage will peak within 48 to 72 hours. Advocacy organizations will issue statements. Some elected officials will call for accountability. Late-night television will spend several nights dissecting the remarks. And then gradually, the story will be displaced by the next controversy, which, in modern American politics, rarely takes long to arrive. But beneath the surface of the news cycle, something longer-term is happening. Every controversy like this adds a layer to the political consciousness of women voters. And women voters, it bears repeating, are the majority of the electorate. They have demonstrated in recent election cycles that they are capable of voting in ways that reflect not just their economic interests, but their sense of dignity, their felt experience of whether the political environment treats them as full citizens or as an afterthought. The long-term implications of repeated controversies like this one are genuinely uncertain, and that uncertainty cuts both ways. On one side, there is historical evidence that moments of high-profile disrespect toward women have galvanized female voters and driven historic turnout. On the other side, there is mounting evidence that institutional fatigue is real, that people can only sustain outrage for so long before they disengage entirely. The question of which of those forces wins in the end is one of the defining questions of this political era. Internationally, the ripple effects matter too. America's political culture does not stay within its borders. The behavior of its leaders is watched, studied, and sometimes imitated by politicians in other countries. When dismissive treatment of women is demonstrated without lasting consequence at the highest levels of American politics, it emboldens similar behavior elsewhere. The global conversation about women's rights, women's leadership, and gender equity in public life is directly shaped by what powerful nations model. That is not an exaggeration. That is how political norms travel across borders. There is one more thing worth saying before we close, and it is perhaps the most uncomfortable truth of all. The fact that this story is not surprising, the fact that most people who saw these headlines thought again before they thought unbelievable, is itself the most important data point. Outrage that becomes predictable loses its power to create change. The normalization of disrespect, even when that disrespect is loudly condemned, is still normalization. And the real danger is not that people are too angry about moments like these. The real danger is that over time, they stop being angry enough. The measure of a political culture is not how often it expresses outrage. It is what it does with that outrage, whether it converts anger into action, whether it demands accountability consistently rather than selectively, whether it is willing to have honest conversations about power and gender that go beyond the immediate controversy and into the structural realities underneath it, because one man's statement is a news story, But the system that makes that statement possible, that gives it power, that protects the person who made it from meaningful consequence, that cycles the outrage through the media machine and spits it out the other side unchanged, that system is a much bigger story. And that is the story that most people are not yet ready to fully face. The question was never just about what Trump said. The question has always been about what we, as a society, are willing to accept, and what that acceptance quietly tells us about who we still are.